Welcome to Game Fondue Reviews. In this video we're going to take a look at Samurai. Samurai is an area influence game in which players are trying to claim various figures in Japan. Let's jump right in with the description of the rules, see a few example turns being played, then I'll be back for some closing remarks. This is Samurai, set up for a 3-player game. To set it up, you assemble the board, and depending on the number of players, you're going to use a different area. For 2 players, you just use this main island. For 3 players, you add this. And with 4 players, you'd add one more part up here to the top. But we're just 3, so we're not going to do that. Also, depending on the number of players, you lay out a certain number of each figure. In a 2-player game, it's 7 of each figure. In a 3-player game, which is us, it's 10 of each figure. And in a 4-player game, it's all or 13 of each figure. Each player picks a color and takes all the tokens in that color. Then they pick 5 to form their starting hand, which you can see there. But then the rest of them are shuffled to form a draw stack like so. The game begins with a placing phase in which all these figures are placed in the different cities of the board. And after that's complete, we'll move on to the player turns, in which players are just going to go in clockwise order, playing tokens from their hand onto the board. The game ends when the last figure of any type is removed from the board, or the 4th figure of one type is set aside, meaning not claimed by a player, but we'll describe that in detail in a little bit. So in the placing phase, you start by first putting one of each type in Ito, and Ito is in all player counts of the game because it's on this main island here. Then in clockwise order, players take turns placing one on each city, and cities are the red areas, and each city can hold 2 different guys. However, both of the guys in the city have to be different types. So if it was this player's turn now, he couldn't put another Buddha here, though he could put a Buddha here. And then after all the cities are filled, then we go on to the villages in which one guy is placed in each, and each village can only hold 1 figure. When all the placing is complete, we move on to the player turns. And they're also going to go in clockwise order, starting with the same player who started placing figures on the board. On a player's turn, they have to play at least 1 tile, but can play any number of tiles with a Japanese symbol on the bottom. You'll see some of the tiles have a Japanese symbol while some do not. You can play 1 of this type and any number of those with a Japanese symbol. You can also play a combination such as 3 with a Japanese symbol and 1 without, but you must play at least 1 tile in all cases. Land tiles must be played on empty land spaces, and you can identify them by their color, so you could play these tiles anywhere you'd like on the board, but ship tiles have to be played on empty sea spaces. Normally you have to play a tile on an empty space, but there's one tile, the token exchange, that you actually play on top of a tile you've already played, like so, in which case you immediately redeploy this tile to another empty space. So it gives you a chance to use 1 tile multiple times. And the last type of tile, the figure exchange, is the only tile that doesn't go on the board. You just play it and then discard it from the game, and what it does is it allows you to switch 2 figures, but you still have to adhere to that rule. So if, for example, there was a Buddha here and there was a rice patty here, I would not be able to switch this rice patty and this Buddha because that would result in 2 Buddhas being in this city. But I can switch any other 2 as long as I follow those rules, and then it's just removed from the game. After a player's done playing tiles for their turn, then they redraw back up to 5. You don't get to redraw after each play because sometimes you might play a whole bunch of tiles in a turn. Also, if your deck runs out, you can only draw as many things as there are in there, so keep that in mind. If a tile placement would ever completely surround a city or a village on land, sea tiles do not count for this, just on land like so. This one is surrounded even though there's a whole bunch of empty sea spaces. You immediately score that region. The way you do that is you count the number of influence each player has adjacent to that based on the different types of figures they're in. So for instance, this guy has 3 influence against rice fields, and this 1 applies to anything. There's this mounted figure as well as these that apply to anybody, and ships also apply to anybody, but there's also tiles specific to the different type of unit. So in this case, obviously green is the only one there, so he would take this and he would claim it, putting it behind his screen. Although in a 2-player game, you keep it in front of your screen. If there was multiple tiles, like we're in a more complicated situation, like we had some from blue and some from red, we may look like this. And at this time, it's still surrounded, so we would still count up the number of influence for each based on the individual figure. So first we would do Buddhas, and we would see that red has 2 influence on Buddhas, and blue has 5 influence on Buddhas against green's 1 influence. So blue would take this and he would claim it because he has the most, and then we would do the same for rice patties. If we were ever in a situation where we were tied, nobody gets to claim the figure, but it gets placed beside the board. And remember, if 4 of the same figure ever get placed beside the board, the game ends after that player's turn. The game also ends after a player's turn if all figures of one type are removed from the board for any reason. They can be claimed or set aside for ties in any combination. At this time, players would lift up their screens and reveal the number of figures they've captured. If a player has captured more types of 2 or 3 figure sets than any other player, he or she immediately wins. So if this player had 6 Buddhas and 6 high helmets, we know that player would immediately win because there's only 10 of each, so no one else could have more. However, if no player has 2 or more of the mosts, then we check players that have 1 of the most. And those players set aside the type they have the most of. So if this player, for instance, had the most rice and this player had the most high helmets, they would set those aside and count the number of other figures they had. Whoever had the most other figures would be the winner. I also want to point out that ties do not count as having the most, so it's possible that
no player has the most of any type, in which case you would just count the total number of figures you have, and whoever has the most figures would win. Let's get going with this example playthrough. Normally these tiles would of course be behind the player's screens, but just to make it a little easier, we're going to put them in front. So the first part of the game is the placing phase, so we're going to start with the yellow player, and he can place any of these figures on any empty city space. So he's just going to stick a high helmet here. Now it's the blue player's turn, and he can place one figure on any city space as well, but he cannot place another helmet here because there can only be one of each type on a place. So he decides to place a Buddha over here, and then the red player goes and he's just going to throw this here, and this player puts this guy over here. So now it's the blue player's turn, but now all the cities are full, so we go into the villages and they just take turns placing one guy on a village, and each village can only hold one guy. Continues like this. We'll jump back when they're finishing up so we can see the game turns. Welcome back. We're about to place the last figure on the board. There's only one space left, so he goes here. Now since this player started the first round, he's going to start this round so he can begin his turn by placing tiles. Remember, he can place any number of tiles with a Japanese character, but only one of another type. He can put any combination therein of the two. He just decides he's going to throw out a high helmet right here worth 2. So then he's going to stop. He could place more that had Japanese characters because this one doesn't, but he's going to draw back up to 5. He's going to take it there. Nothing is completely surrounded on land, so nothing happens yet at this point. Now it's this player's turn, and he decides he's going to throw a 3 here. Now this is completely surrounded, so we're going to score it at this time. This 3 applies to both, so 3, of course, is greater than 2. So this player is going to take the high helmet behind his screen, and he's captured him. He can continue placing things, although he has to place things with Japanese characters, though, because this doesn't have one. He decides he's good for right now, so he's going to stop, and he's going to draw another thing to refill his hand to 5. And now it's Red's turn, and he's going to be really aggressive. He's first going to lay out a ship, and that has a Japanese character on it, so he can continue placing. Then he's going to lay out this guy, who also has a Japanese character on him, so he can place one more. So he's going to throw down this. Now this is completely surrounded on land. There's still an empty sea space, but that's okay. So he has 1, 2, 3, 4 influence for the high helmet. Blue has 3, and yellow has 2. So he's going to claim it, put it behind his screen, and his turn is done, so he's going to draw back up to 5. So the game is going to continue like this. We'll jump ahead to when some of the special tiles are used. Welcome back. You can see a lot more tiles are on the board, and one was even placed aside because there was a tie for most influence. So it's the red player's turn. He's first going to play the figure exchange. Now remember, when he plays this, he still has to adhere to the rules that there can't be 2 of the same in one spot. So for instance, he couldn't swap these because then there would be 2 high helmets here. But when he plays this one, this is the only tile that just gets discarded. So he's actually going to swap this Buddha and this rice right here. And then for his next move, because this had a Japanese character on it, he can play more. He's going to play a Buddha here. Now blue only has 1 influence because all the rest of these are rice influence, but he has 2 Buddha influence. So he collects that, and then he draws back up. We'll jump ahead to when somebody uses their token exchange. Welcome back. It's almost the end of the game. It's the red player's turn. He's going to use his token exchange, so he has to put it on a place of the map. It has value 0, and he takes the token off that space, so he gets this Buddha back, and he immediately redeploys it. So he's going to throw that Buddha over here, and now this is completely surrounded, and he, of course, will win the Buddha because it's 4 influence against 3, so he takes that to his area. And now it's the yellow player's turn. He can't draw back up because his deck is totally depleted. This yellow player's turn is actually going to be the last of the game because he's first going to do the figure exchange. Remember, that has a Japanese character. He's going to switch these 2 here, and then he's going to lay down a 2 here. Now what that does is it has eliminated all of the high helmets from the board, so they're all off, and he gets this one as well. But because all of one type are gone, even though there's still a few left, the game is over. Now we tally the scores. I put everybody's figures in front of their area, so we check by each type who has the most. Unfortunately, there's no most for the high helmets because both of these players have 4, so that's a tie. This player has the most Buddhas, though, because he has 4, and this guy has 3, and this guy has 1. So we'll set those aside to indicate that he has the most of something. And also, there is no most for rice fields because both of these players have 3. So because neither of these players have the most of anything, this guy wins. If multiple players had the most, so let's just pretend that this player had the most high helmets, then we would count the number of other things. So their most would be set aside, and we would count 1, 2, 3, 4 against 5. So this player would have still won if that was the case.
Samurai can get really tense, especially near the end of the game when you really want to claim some of those figures before time runs out. But that's because as you place things on the board, it's typically not very difficult for the other person to overtake you, especially in a game with multiple players. There's a lot of different things that could happen before it becomes your turn again. But even in a game with just 2, there's those tiles with those Japanese characters on them, so theoretically someone can place a whole bunch in a turn, and that really keeps you on edge. It definitely helps to know what tiles are in each player's stack, and it's really neat that you can choose your starting hand of 5. I like that a lot because it adds some strategy to the game. Also, the scoring is it's a little bit strange, but the scoring really makes the game. You have to kind of understand and pay attention to what other people are going for. You can't just claim as many things as you want, and you do have to do so, strategically. It really makes for an interesting game. So if it looks fun to you, check it out. That's Samurai.